Alright, YouTube, I'd like to talk a little bit about Satan and God, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, that is. I'm not talking about, Brahma or Elohim or any of those figures. But if you really think about it, and here's one area in which atheists and Satanists and so forth have been lacking, unfortunately. A lot of atheists and Satanists and so forth don't spend a lot of time learning about Christianity. That is, the history behind it, the actual theological perspective on the religion from the various different sources, Catholic, Protestant, Orthodox, whatever. And so, while they oppose those religious forces which are causing ignorance and violence in the world, Christianity and Islam and so forth definitely do, they don't really know how to effectively refute it other than to say, herp derp, there's no evidence for God. Well, that parroting old line only works so well because while there is indeed no evidence that there is a God, it doesn't really work simply to say that, because if you don't understand the history of Christianity, you don't understand much more effective ways in which it can be refuted. And there are many of them. For instance, just looking at the nature of the Christian God, look at the Old Testament. For those of you who have read it, look at the nature of Jehovah, or Yahweh, whichever one you want to call. The nature of this God, and it has been stated, even Thomas Jefferson admitted that the nature of the Christian God was basically a cruel, ignorant, jealous tyrant who spent the majority of his existence creating something and then trying to alternately destroy it, as though he were bipolar. That is, that the Jews in the Old Testament, if you look at most of the stories about this God, were continuously ordered to commit genocide, to burn people, to stone them, to kill one another, to kill other tribes. They wiped out the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, and so forth, enslaving other groups of people even after they had in turn been enslaved and knew how bad it was, to then go and, kill all of the non-virgin women, but then take all the virgins and force them into marriage. All these terrible things that the God of the Bible has done. And I think that's something that atheists and Satanists need to understand more of, that when they really read the Bible and they really look at the history of Christianity and also the biblical texts referring to the nature of God, they will see God primarily as a genocidal tyrant. And it's also something that can be said that if you look at God and Satan and you compare them to one another, you can almost essentially state that while Christians are extremely upset whenever they find out that someone is a Satanist because they assume they worship the devil, and they say, well, why would you want to choose that dark, hideous, evil path of violence and terrible, terrible things that will happen to you and you'll go to hell and all of these things that they imagine will happen to us? And they don't understand that if you actually read the Bible, Satan really seems more like the good guy in the Bible. All he ever does is tempt people to do what is wrong or basically against God's will. God spends all of his time apparently ordering people to kill one another. Satan never does that. No, not once in the Bible does Satan say, go to war and, slay the virgins and stone these heathens. I'm going to, Satan never flooded the earth and killed off 99% of life, forcing man to survive on a raft for 40 days and 40 nights with 2 of every animal. Even if you believe that story is true from a Christian perspective, you have to understand it was God that created the flood in the first place and killed all the people. And the Christians will qualify this by saying, well, they were wicked, they deserved to die. If you really want to look at it that way, why was there wickedness in the world in the first place? Did God allow it to happen, in which case he's obviously inept, or did God create that wickedness in the world just so that he could destroy 99% of the population? It really seems like the latter is the case. In many cases, it looks like God deliberately set man up to fail. Marquis de Sade said to listen to the notions expounded by most theologians, God created man simply with a view to crowding hell, and that seems to be certainly the way in which most Christians look at the world. Now on to some claims of Christians. First claim, that there is a literal place called hell, either underneath the earth, as the medieval Christians believed, and some conspiratorial Christians still believe that there's an actual hell inside of the earth, literally under the crust, that there's an actual hell there. Or more of an ethereal spiritual place, as more Christians probably believe is the case. You've got to understand something about the term hell. The term hell is not Christian in origin. The term hell is not Jewish in origin. It's Norse. It comes from Norse paganism, and it comes from a word H-E-L, hell. And this was simply the location where the sun set in Scandinavia on the winter solstice. The pagans in Scandinavia believed that the souls of the departed, those who had died, went to this place, hell, which was literally a physical location where they imagined that the sun rested upon the earth on the winter solstice. There was no suffering there. It was basically similar to the Greek underworld. People were sort of asleep. People were sort of, out of it. They were dead. The Christians took, in the medieval era, this word hell, and in order to convert the Norse pagans, began using it as their own term for the place where the spirits of the damned went. That is, they said, well, the spirits of the dead, if they're virtuous and they're good people and they follow Jesus, they don't go to hell. They go up to heaven. Hell is actually the place of suffering. The Norse pagans never believed it to be a place of suffering. It was just interchangeably the place where people went when they died. The Christians, much later, added their version of hell. Now, the reason why they added the idea of fire and suffering comes from a different term, which is Jewish in origin, called Gehenna. And Gehenna was a physical location outside of Jerusalem, a very real place. It was sort of a dump. And they used to burn trash there. Now, the Jewish used this as a metaphor. That was, Gehenna was a metaphor for those whose souls were wicked. That if a person was wicked, they killed people, they lied, they cheated, they dishonored their parents, committed adultery. They were basically terrible people. That their souls were no better than if they had gone to Gehenna and been burned into nothingness. It wasn't considered a real place, a resting place for the dead. It was considered a physical location and a metaphor. The Christians took the metaphor of Gehenna from Jewish lore and extrapolated it to be a real place, perhaps through mistranslation of the word, perhaps through scribes later adding this material in order to create more fear and confusion among those who weren't already Christian, and to tell them they were going to suffer forever if they didn't repent and turn to Jesus and join the Catholics. Whatever the case may be, though, Gehenna originally was simply a metaphoric location for a metaphor for the damned souls. It wasn't considered a real place until far later. In the Catholic years, in the, I believe, 400s AD, was when the term first started being widely used, and of course hell comes later in the Middle Ages. But if you look at the Bible, notwithstanding the fact that hell really didn't exist in early Christianity, the Gnostics certainly never believed in a place like hell. They considered it more of a mind state of those who had not achieved an enlightened state and understood the true teachings of God. Notwithstanding that fact, if you look at the God of the Bible, the Christian God and or the Jewish God, seems like a really bad sort of being that you wouldn't really want to trust with your soul forever. Whereas Satan comes off as this shining, glorious character of virtue for merely willing to do God's work and really not doing much else. The Bible really doesn't dwell on the concept of Satan very much. The Bible scarcely mentions Satan in comparison to many other figures like Abraham or Jesus or God. All these other figures, Moses or David or so forth, the Bible mentions them a load of times. It rarely mentions Satan. Satan's biggest role is as the tempter of Job. Now, if Christians take the book of Job literally, and here's another thing that atheists and Satanists should learn. If you take the book of Job seriously, and most evangelical Christians consider the Bible absolutely literal, they take every part of it completely literally, the book of Job proposes a Satan that is merely a tempter of man, not inherently evil, not trying to get people to do evil, but merely testing them for God. It's like saying that a teacher that gives you an F on your math exam is somehow evil for doing so. In reality, it was your lack of studying that gave you the F in the first place. The Satan of Job is merely as the one who delivers the temptation so that God can see whether you're worthy or not of his, either blessing or his, the Messiah, Jesus, or something along those lines. You're worthy of going to heaven, you're worthy of receiving some sort of compensation for your suffering. But Satan in the Bible, you never see this pitchfork-wielding, horned character with a tail roasting people in hell. You simply do not see that. What you do see an allusion to is a lake of fire in Revelation, which was dubiously canonized at best, and in fact another thing that most of the people in the left-hand path gloss over. The book of Revelation was controversial even at the time of its penning. It was almost not included in the Bible, and even many Christian theologians who are Christians themselves, agree Revelation is not about any future date or the present times. It was actually symbolic writing about Rome. That is to say that Rome was the great whore of Babylon. It was the great city. It was about to fall. It was oppressing the Christians and Jews. You couldn't do anything without Caesar's money. Everything fits ancient Rome. Rome was the world back then. Everything in Revelation fits perfectly to the description of Rome, from the emperors oppressing the Christians and Jews to every other part of Revelation. So most legitimate theologians believe Revelation shouldn't be taken literally. In a modern context, it was about Rome. Only there do we see an allusion to the lake of fire and the idea of actual literal suffering for the people. The metaphor behind it seems to be this: that Rome is following the path of wickedness, not a literal being, Satan, but a path of wickedness. And those who partake in the Roman Empire and allow this sort of oppression to occur will be metaphorically cast into the lake of fire, because Rome is going to collapse from the inside out. Ironically, it came true. Technically, the prophecy of Revelation, if you can call it a prophecy, symbolic writing, whatever you want to call it, technically came true already. Rome collapsed. The Roman population suffered for 1,000 years. There were insane problems with that part of the world for 1,000 years. Everything in Revelation fits perfectly to Rome. Only there do we see the lake of fire, and it seems to be more metaphor than to be taken literally. So if you really look at the Bible, there's no real reason to believe that Christians should be even engaging in speaking about people suffering forever for not obeying Jesus or obeying God, that they're going to go to hell if they don't convert to Christianity. And of course the Protestants would say Protestant Christianity, the Catholics would say Catholic Christianity. So again, even if you convert to Christianity, you're still being condemned by other Christians. Another problem with the logic behind the Bible, that there are so many groups involved in claiming they have the one representative Christian path. And Satan, in the Bible, is the good guy. It's God that's the tyrant. God is the one that constantly puts his hand down on the world and destroys everything in his path. Only a handful of characters in the Bible, like Job or Moses, are ever blessed by God. And even people like Solomon or David face their own problems during their lives and end up getting fucked in the end too. The God of the Bible even mistreats the people who are most loyal to him, such as Job, and constantly makes them suffer as well. God makes his enemies suffer, God makes his friends suffer, God makes his son suffer, God makes his tempter Satan suffer in the lake of fire, God makes the rebellious angels suffer, God makes everybody suffer. A legitimate reading of the Bible reads like some strange medieval transcript about the worst tyrant in Bavaria who constantly, trods over his people's cabbage patches just to watch them starve. I mean, it's insane to think that anybody would worship a being which condemns life and liberty and happiness as much as the Christian God does. Christianity and Judaism, an importation from the Middle Eastern deserts which got Romanized, is a very, very strange religion when you really take a look at the Bible, and I think that's something more atheists, Satanists, pagans, Wiccans, Setians, Thelemites, and so forth We need to read about the history of Christianity and their theology in order to actively refute their religion. Peace out.